Hello, marketers. This is the Funnel Lab, and welcome to Funnel Lab Fridays. Funnel Lab Fridays is a weekly LinkedIn live session where we dive into use cases and challenges for sort of data-savvy marketers. I'm your host, Eric Westerkamp, CEO here at CaliberMind. And joining me today is Tracy Earles, Senior Director of Marketing Analytics at NetApp. And returning to the show is Misha Salkinder, Director of Customer Data Strategy here at CaliberMind. And today, the three of us, or primarily Tracy and Misha, to be honest, will be discussing sort of the underlying equations for marketing ROI. Welcome, Tracy and Misha. Misha,
Thanks,
welcome
Eric.
back. Tracy, we've had sort of many conversations over the years, and are glad to have you on the show. Some of them about marketing and business, many about cycling. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about your role at NetApp, and when you began defining sort of, the equation that you talk about for marketing ROI and why.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me. My role at NetApp, I run the marketing, reporting, and analytics team. NetApp has maybe 250 or 300 marketers that we serve. And kind of in partnership with our data science team, we try to uncover actionable insights in lots of marketing data. About a couple years ago, we started down the path of better identifying a pipeline that we think was sourced by marketing, right? And that was in the response to several requests from executives, either the president who runs marketing and sales or the CFO or whomever. They're trying to understand the value of the money that they're investing in marketing. And so the first step was, well, let's identify the pipeline that we're bringing in the company. And throughout this conversation today, I'm going to talk about pipeline instead of revenue.
Yep.
NetApp sells large capital equipment, high dollar value capital equipment. The sales process can be a year or more. Mm-hmm. And so at the point at which we identify an opportunity for a sale, it might still be 3 to 6 months before that sale closes. So we marketers don't really focus on revenue. We focus on pipeline for earlier indicators of actionable insights. So anyway, we developed a way to measure marketing contributed pipeline. And so we presented that to our leadership, and the president said, "This is awesome. This is the first time I've seen this. This is great stuff." Now, I also know how much I spend on marketing, so I should be able to understand marketing ROI, right? There should be an equation. In his mind, it's very simple.
Right.
I give you $1 and I get something in return.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the ask. And actually, the way he worded the question was, if I have some extra budget, let's say $1 million, $5 million, it doesn't really matter what it is. Should I invest that in marketing programs, or should I invest that in hiring more salespeople? Mm-hmm. And so that was the challenge that it gave us. I find that question a little, hopefully he's not listening, a little frustrating, because there's this implied dichotomy in that question that it's either marketing or sales. Mm-hmm. And the truth is, marketing can't generate pipeline if there isn't a salesperson that actually calls on that account and quantifies that opportunity, right? So there's a partnership there. Or to say it differently, if he wants to hire a salesperson, that salesperson can't call on, let's say, an account that's never heard of NetApp and successfully find $1 million sale opportunity. Marketing had to essentially open the door for him.
Sure.
And so to me, it's much more a partnership than the question implies.
Yeah.
But I don't get to sort of make that argument. I just have to answer the question. Mm-hmm. So my team has done a lot of work in how do we answer that question? And there's complexity on what I would say both the numerator and the denominator of the answer, right? So the numerator is pipeline. The denominator is investment. And so pipeline is complicated because you need to identify the pipeline that's attributed to marketing. And at a company like ours, and just to sort of give you a sort of indication of the complexity, right? I already said we have like 250 or 300 marketers. We generated 3,000 campaign codes in the last fiscal year, right? So all of these marketers are doing all kinds of different things. And we need our sort of data and our models and that very simple equation needs to pull a ton of different types of data into the equation. And so then if you think about the investment side, right? Not all marketing investment is designed to drive demand. There's what I would call brand investment, really just general awareness of the company that does help drive demand, but it also helps drive sales success. It helps our investor and analyst relations. It does a lot of things that aren't specific to driving demand. And so that's part of what we have to think about when we review the investment costs. And another sort of indicator of the complexity is, I think we probably had 200 lines of budget items in the first fiscal quarter of our year that we had to go through line by line and say, is that demand or is that something else? And even within demand, let's say we run an event. We run a lot of events. And that, we have to manufacture a booth for events, and we transport that booth, right? There's an overhead associated with this channel. It's not necessarily attributable to a single event. And so my team has to actually think about every single line item and what makes sense to be in the equation versus excluded from the equation. So it's fun.
It's super interesting. I love the sort of the context of, coming into marketing saying, if I had an extra $10 million, what would you do with it and what would I get back? It's also just the flip side of, where a lot of organizations are these days, which is, hey, by the way, I need you to cut 5 million, but I need you to do it without impacting growth or revenue. Right. And so, so when you start to think about that, you start to think about, okay, now I've got all these channels, right? I got all these programs rolling the channels, and, I've gone through the hard work of taking the budgets and putting them down onto these channels. How do you then break it down so you actually can make that decision? Like, what are you looking at to say, like, well, you know what, if I'm going to add, I'm going to put it here or in these 3 cases, or if I'm going to remove, I'm going to take it from here. Like, what do you look for kind of within that data and in that ROI to kind of help you make those decisions?
So, I talked about attributed pipeline. And one of the things that our data science team has been really good at doing is understanding the marketing touch points that have the biggest lever on attributed pipeline. And so I can actually show you kind of what we've developed, and I'll get to that in a second, but it's part of the complexity of the data is we in our, I don't know, 50 million rows of data or whatever it is that things that happen a lot, like we send a ton of email. Actually, we send more than a ton of email, and it's probably a metric ton. But those touch points can sort of swamp. Those are sort of what I would say high volume, low value touch points. And so in there, you need to pick out the low volume, high, or it doesn't have to be low volume, but the hardest to find are the low volume, high value ones. And we've worked a lot with Misha to sort of build models that help us extract that.
That's great. Misha, as you've looked across, I know you've implemented ROI with NetApp, you've done it with customers of ours, you've done it with us. What do you see for other organizations as they start to kind of go down this journey of, okay, I want to be able to tie dollars to my channels, and I want to kind of differentiate. I think there's a big difference between trying to take your overall budget and being able to break that down by channel or some metric, then sort of these bottom up roll ups of like just like, here's my ad spend, here's what I'm spending on LinkedIn, here's that tied directly to campaigns, right? I see these two as very different exercises, because one is very tactical and it's like, okay, I'm pulling a data feed from Google and it's telling me I spent this, 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 and this, and you got the campaigns, and you can tie things up very directly, right? But it's usually, it's like a window into the spend. But like, if you think about the overall marketing spend, is this, and then if you want to include sales spend, it's, that. How do you see companies kind of handling that? And it ties back to your point there, Tracy, where you're saying like, hey, I've got this infrastructure, I built a booth, I did this, where does that spend go? That's not showing up in the the ad data feed coming from these social platforms and stuff like that.
Yeah. I've found there are some organizations that try, look to attack this problem and get to as close to a perfect, this event is worth this many dollars and it cost me this much. So I can almost get to like an event, like an interaction specific ROI. And I've been fortunate to work with a NetApp team that has brought a lot of, I think, structure and very smart assumptions to how the ROI journey will go. One of the first things Tracy noted is we are going to need to introduce assumptions in our very initial versions of this, because I think you brought an example of, well, we're going to introduce an additional touch in the journey, and at no fault of a marketer, their touch that was worth X yesterday is now worth X minus a 30%. And that's not exactly, that's not the reality. So I think the best path forward is to get to a model that has certain assumptions, and then we start dissecting the numerator and the denominator. So as it comes to the numerator, we do explore, and hopefully we'll see, an example of this now, where there are certain campaign types or channels that are very low cost by nature. Email being one of those. Organic search, how do we even put a cost on that? Now, there are some models that introduce a cost. Maybe we can introduce personnel, for example, into the model and looking at a kind of a top-down ROI. So that's one way. Another way is to think about the attribution model. And just like Tracy noted, can we actually weight things differently? And then on the denominator is we have to think about, how do we break down the costs themselves? Are there costs we want to include or exclude as part of this model? So I think that there are organizations that understand that it's a journey, and there are certain insights we can get even from a fairly rudimentary model that uses assumptions. And then with iterating on this, you can probably get to more granular insight. But I wouldn't skip this initial step.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, two takeaways from that. One is, it sounds like the attribution model itself is very important, because it's really creating that sort of that bottom number that you're kind of, putting things, that's really kind of controlling how much weighting your different programs are getting, right, based upon your cost. But also that you need to really be looking at directionality, if that makes sense, right? As opposed to it being 100% accurate, right? Because we all know that getting this data right, no matter how much time put in, is hard, and it's never 100%. That doesn't mean it's not telling you directionally what's working and what's not. So you can because at the end of the day, I don't care if the numbers are 100% right, because this isn't going into my financial statements. I'm trying to make decisions. Again, it comes back to, if I have $10 million more, what am I going to do with it to have the most impact? If I can make a good decision there, that's relatively directional, job one, right? I mean, that's kind of the goal of these things.
Yeah, a couple thoughts there. I kind of started this story about the journey by describing the question that was posed to us, right? If I have $5 million more marketing or sales, that's a different question than did my campaign achieve a good ROI?
Yeah.
And you know, as you guys may know, I published a blog series, a series of posts on my blog, and you know, all 6 readers really enjoyed it. But the final one, you know, I basically say, look, perfect ROI analysis is impossible.
Yeah.
But usable ROI analysis is certainly achievable. And so, you know, Misha talked a little bit about assumptions, right? We are about to publish our first ROI dashboard, and I'll show you a couple kind of simplified views of that. But you know, for us to be able to even publish that, the first major assumption we made was we are going to include in the equation this quarter's pipeline divided by this quarter's marketing investment, knowing that that marketing investment this quarter was really intended to drive pipeline in the future. And so eventually, over time, we will be able to build time cohorts and better align outcomes to investments. But that doesn't mean we don't have actionable insights today, even though we're making a really bold assumption there.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I just got at a board meeting this week, and a lot of our discussion was, you know, our sales and marketing efficiency, right? Which is basically that calculation. And we made the assumption last quarter's spend over this quarter's bookings, right? You know, use those two to kind of help give that offset on sales. But it's a pretty, you know, at the end of the day, you got to get this set up in spreadsheets and in reports and all that. So it's a pretty gross, like, boom, you know, assume that for the whole thing and for all channels and all that. You can get much more granular, but it still gives you really good information about how is it working? What is your efficiency? Is your efficiency going up or going down? Right. And then, and then if you can at least break that down at some level to see the channel efficiencies, you can start to really understand, hey, I'm really efficient in these channels, but I'm not so efficient here. And we have a lot of dialogue around, we get to something called elasticity, which is, okay, if I were to put more money in, I mean, this may be my most efficient channel, but it has no headroom, right? There's no, like, I could throw more, like, I can't really, there's only X events being run that we can go to. There's no more place to put the money.
Yeah.
Right. So I got to maybe look at channels that are less efficient, but they have more elasticity in them.
Right. Yeah. Let me
why don't we
share.
jump into your report, because I think it talks to some of that.
Yeah. So as I said, I've kind of I've removed the numbers from these views. I think that's it.
Yeah, awesome.
Okay, so this is a super simplified view of all the different kinds of campaigns that we run to generate demand. So obviously email is email. Everybody understands that. You may not know what EBC is. EBC is our executive briefing center. We bring customers into this dedicated facility that can meet with senior leaders of the company and technical experts and things like that. .com assets are specific assets on our website that are designed to convert. Not everything on the website is designed to convert, but we have, you know, free trials and things like that. Events should be self-explanatory, and then we have, you know, content syndication, gifting, and hospitality. And so, you know, the first thing you see on this, and by the way, the numbers 0x to 117x, that is the output of the equation. That is pipeline divided by investment. So Misha mentioned earlier, email is very close to free. So you expect it to have a very high return. So let's think about email then as compared to something like events. Events cost a lot of money. And so you would expect them to have a lower ROI, but what's good? And so another way to view the same data is on a bubble chart, right? So again, this is attributed pipeline compared to cost. and demand programs specifically.
Mhm.
So you can, and the radius of the bubble, the size of the bubble is related to the ROI, right? So you see that big gray email content, right? So and by the way, this cost axis is logarithmic, right? Because if I didn't make it logarithmic, email is sitting on the 0 axis, and it just doesn't sort of tell the story that we want it to tell. So to your point about elasticity and my prior statement of, we send a lot of email.
Yeah.
Right. You would think, okay, with that big gray ROI and that low cost, I should be able to pump out more email. Well, any demand marketer knows there is a point at which that breaks, right? And so unsubscribes shoot up, or you just can't send more emails to the same finite set of contacts.
Yeah.
Now you see on the top right, events, right? High cost, but they have the most attributed pipeline. And so, so then you think, okay, well, are there more events that I could do? Can I make that channel more efficient?
Yeah.
Can I attend the same events, but not by, the platinum sponsorship or things like that?
Right.
That's a valid set of follow-on questions that you think, okay, well, if events give me access to all that revenue, can I push that yellow dot to the left to increase the diameter of the dot?
Yeah.
And the answer is probably yes. Or if you take a next level view of all of those events, and again, in a year, we probably do 200 events. Wow. Now, these aren't all these big, massive, third-party events. Some are very small field events, but we do a ton. And so we could probably start sorting that list based on this math to, cull the underperformers and boost the overperformers.
And that, I assume, is where you would eventually want that more discrete campaign level cost structure. Like, you don't want to look at it here because it's too granular. But then when you're deciding, okay, now I want to dig into specific events, specific campaigns to try to optimize, that's when you want that really kind of detailed view.
You do, but then you got to be cognizant of the problem that Misha was stating earlier, is which I will state differently, which is basically the more you drill into this metric, the more you break the metric. And so the example he gave was, all of this is based on attributed pipeline, where we take all of the pipeline and all of the engagement touch points, and based on a lot of intelligent modeling, we assign a dollar amount to each touch point. So let's say we have an account that attended an event, and there were 10 total touch points at that account. And so we use, we try to do the math on that event touch point, right? Attributed pipeline divided by the cost of that event. But what if that account all of a sudden attends a different event, or attends a webinar? That same pipeline is now going to be redistributed to incorporate this new event. So that the actual value attributed to that event touch point has dropped down, even though nothing changed about that event touch point.
Yeah, right.
And so there is a point at which that broad math of attributed pipeline divided by investment breaks. So what do you do then? Right. And I think the answer is you evaluate, let's say, different events against each other, potentially based on different metrics, right? Operational metrics, right? How many people did we engage at that event? Were there follow-on actions after that event, right? Emails is a very simple example, right? An email click really isn't worth much. And in fact, we don't even credit an email click until they actually do something else.
Yeah.
Right? A post-click engagement. So if they come to the website, oh, that's interesting. If they come to the website and then go to a subsequent page, now that click actually, we say that did something, right? And there's something attributable there. But what I tell our marketers is, don't ask the question, what's the ROI of my campaign? Because I don't think that's a valid way to evaluate your campaign. If it's an email campaign, you use email metrics to judge whether that's a good email campaign versus other email campaigns. But don't use ROI to judge your email campaign versus a webinar campaign.
Got it.
Yeah,
You're
that's
saying
interesting.
good.
I would say that there probably are also what I would call something like an effectiveness metric that could be appropriate on a campaign level, where we say, well, how has this campaign contributed to movement of these organizations in their awareness of our company, right? So that perhaps a certain campaign was able to move from initial stage of awareness to perhaps a higher state of qualification for that account. We're not even talking dollars here. So it is, it's not quite an operational metric, but it's somewhere between, where it is familiarity, perhaps. I like your earlier point of some brand awareness campaigns. A very interesting way could be movement through the funnel measurement.
Exactly.
And then what I really like about this is you very clearly spelled out for the organization and for our work together, the two levers that we have in place. You know, the numerator and denominator on the two axes here. And that's where a lot of our work together is about introducing, now that the equation is set, making sure that we do our best, you know, introduce maybe perhaps new assumptions, but do our best to make sure the attributed pipeline makes sense. You know, your point about certain touches not getting credit because we haven't found that touch to be enough of a strong engagement. Or how do we deal with 10 touches by the same organization on the same event? Should we do some math there in order to make sure this data is more valid?
Right, agreed. Let me just, for completeness, show this third view of the same data, which is a geographic view. Right, so again, the same attributed pipeline, but now we've sorted it into regions. We group together EMEA and Latin America, which, you know, geographically makes all the sense in the world. But so a couple points with this, right? You think, you know, Asia Pacific appears to be underperforming in terms of their access to pipeline, but their ROI is the best on the chart. So is there more pipeline available in that region? So let me back up a step. What questions could this view answer? And if APAC is leading in terms of ROI, can I pump more money into marketing in that region if there is more accessible pipeline? There may not be, right? The reason North America is way up on the top right is our market is biggest in North America. And but you also see that we're paying a lot of money to access that market. Yeah. There may not be more events or things that we can do in Asia Pacific. You know what I think, one thing I think is interesting, I was thinking about this last night, is the Asia Pacific and the well, let's say the non-North American markets have language translation costs. And I'm kind of surprised when I look at this data that the costs of marketing in those regions isn't greater. And frankly, I don't know why the costs with North America are so high. You know, this is data we just saw for the first time last week, right? So it's new to us as well. We haven't had a chance to drill into this to understand what the learnings are.
Right. That's super interesting. Well, you know, we're kind of running out of time. Tracy, I know that you, Misha, and I have spent a fair amount of time talking about this stuff. We could probably go on for hours, which we've done in the past. But Tracy, really appreciate your being on the show this week. You know, I'll be honest, some of the insights that you've brought to us over the years have obviously made it into our product and informed us greatly on how we build and look at these things. Right. We've got a new ROI module out there, and it takes a lot of this learnings that we've read your blog. I'm one of the 6. And we use that stuff in our product, right? As we develop this, because when we think about how do you do ROI, not so much for the smaller organizations, right? Because smaller organizations, things are much more tactical. The campaign levels really good. But when you start to really grow this up for larger organizations, and they need to understand ROI, and they need to understand it by channel, things change dramatically, right? The numbers have to, they're looking for much more the trends of what's going on than that individual item. And I love your idea of like, hey, maybe when you get down here, you shouldn't use ROI at the campaign level. You should be using, whatever the metric is, like, or I like, Misha, your idea of, is it actually moving people down funnel? Boom. And how effective is it against other things to move people down the funnel? And if you know that, then you kind of have a good view of whether it's a successful campaign or not. The cost of it should roll up into these higher level ROIs that you're looking at much more strategically.
So a quick comment with regard to big companies versus small companies.
Yeah.
You kind of made the statement that, maybe this isn't as hard for small companies. Maybe, between our data science team and my marketing reporting team, we have 15 people solving this problem. Small company might have half of one person.
It's true.
And so it's not necessarily easier for small companies. And they may also not have as much, let's say, delineation and types of investments, right? Their investments tend to get smeared together.
Yep.
And so for instance, the overhead that I described about events, right? Building a booth, transporting the booth, that's all probably buried in a single number for a small company, right? We attended the VMworld conference and it was $100,000.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's a different set of challenges for small companies.
Yeah.
It's not easier or harder. It's just different.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. Good point. Tracy, Misha, thanks so much for being on the show this week. Okay, that wraps up the episode of Funnel Lab Fridays. Next week, we have Raja Walia, the CEO of GNW Consulting, will be joining us to talk about ABM personalization and how you run that at scale. Gentlemen, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.